Hey everyone, today we're doing an SLI benchmark on GTX 1070. So we just got our second 1070 in the shop. This is an MSI Gaming X, and we've already got the Founders Edition, aka Reference 1070. So we're putting these in SLI today for a benchmark. And before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by Enermax and their new LickMax Giant Open Loop Liquid Cooling Solution. So the SLI setup here, this is not an ideal setup, and that's for a few reasons. One, these cards are not identical. You normally want identical cards, just kind of ideally to keep things simple, but that's not what we have, and that's not what we can get because this is still a brand new card, and right now a mix of two is the best I've got. So we're going to do that anyway because it still works. It works just fine, really. As a user, the downside is that you're generally going to be kind of locked to your slowest device. That would be the Founders Edition card in this case. So we'll lose some of the overclocking, pre-overclock benefit of the MSI version, but we're going to go ahead and use them anyway. So I'm just going to put this in the top slot. It is the best card after all, and if we decide to do any overclocking later, it's just going to be easier if I have that there, especially if we remove the Founders Edition one. So we've got that in there. That's good enough. Let's go ahead and connect this one to the lower slot. And now for SLI, the game has changed. So as you've probably seen in our review of the 1070, the 1080, it's not the same anymore as it used to be, where you could just use one cable between these feet at the top. Now there needs to be a high bandwidth bridge for Pascal, which we don't have a high bandwidth bridge, but we've got these LED bridges, they're called. And by NVIDIA's spec, an LED bridge is just as good for our purposes. The only place a high bandwidth bridge does better is in 5K and surround, which we're not testing today. So we're going to go ahead and use the LED bridge, again, effectively the same as the high bandwidth bridge for our purposes. This is a high bandwidth bridge, higher clock rate, and we've encountered a problem already. So here's the issue. Because the reference card has a shorter PCB, and because I have no flexible bridge, that's obviously not going to work. I don't know if we're not going to be able to force that to work. So that's no good. Unless we start hacking apart the bridge or something like that. That's no good. So we got a couple options here. One of them is, and I will explain this, I'm not going to do it, but I'll explain it just so you all know. We've got these two ribbon cables. These are not high bandwidth. Even though one is branded as ROG, it's not special. It's just like this one branded by NVIDIA. So one thing that people have asked is, can you just do this? Do two ribbon bridges equal one high bandwidth bridge or LED bridge? And the answer is no. So these are actually, regardless of the fact that there are two, they are operating on a 400 megahertz clock. So they oscillate at 400 megahertz. And these bridges are 650 megahertz. That's a good deal different. And having two doesn't make up for that. You get some gain, but you don't get it all back. And we'll show that in a future benchmark. So I really don't want to do this. This isn't going to be representative of the best case scenario, and I don't know that we have the ideal situation for this. But one thing we can do, I think I have one somewhere. Here we go. So I've got these riser cables. And some people are probably laughing at this already, but we have these from SIs for use in small form factor PCs. And riser cables are all they do is sort of elevate the PCIe slot, and they're used very regularly in small form factor PCs that these system integrators build, and that's normally to show off the faceplate of the card, but we're going to use it for a more practical reason. We're going to connect this here. I'm sure some of you will cringe at this, but it will work. Connect that there. There's nothing conductive on the bottom of this. It's all plastic and ribbon. So I'm not worried about that making contact with the board. I'm going to connect this card into it. And now our video card is taller. It's a bit floppy, but it's taller. So let's go ahead and I think we have to figure out which one of these will line up. I think this one will work. This is actually a four-way bridge for Maxwell, but it's still high bandwidth. And as long as we line up the parts here with two headers, then it'll work well for Pascal. So let's see if this will line up. That looks promising. Okay, so that's actually lined up. I'm gonna be needlessly neurotic here and get it so that the MSI logos face up, and so that the extra header at the top is bleeding over the north of the top card, just because I want it out of the way in case we're doing something over here. So they're connected. This is reasonably stable. Fan's not going to be spinning crazy fast, so it's not going to spin loose or anything like that. I'm happy with that for testing. I would not say this is representative of what a user would do, because I don't think, first of all, we can't get a screw in there unless we get like an inch-long screw. Secondly, that's not going to work in a case, but it will work for testing. And so here's the thing. We're using a ribbon or a riser cable now. PCIe riser cables, we've tested this, have about a 1% measurable but imperceptible impact on frame rate performance. So what does that mean here? Well, when I say 1%, I'm talking about, I tested it on a Maxwell card, and it was a single card. This is Pascal, first of all. Pascal has new SLI rules, and it's also 2 devices. So I'm not 100% sure how big the impact will be, but I would expect still somewhere around the 1% area. We can still get really good and accurate results from this configuration. Just know that they might be slightly improved if we were to do it with cards that are the same height, which you want to do anyway. But in order to test the impact of this cable, I would need 2 devices of the same height anyway, and I would need the high bandwidth bridges. But we have some friends at other organizations who are helping us test that. So let's go ahead and throw this on the bench. We've got it set up more or less. I'll do the power. Once that's connected, we'll run some benchmarks and come back with the results. All right, so we've got the results in, ran all of the tests for 1070 SLI versus 1070 standard, including a 1080 and a bunch of other cards. Let's go through Doom, Ashes of the Singularity, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, The Division, and GTA 5. I ran a lot more tests than are present here. I had help from some of our technicians with these. So check the article linked in the description below for all of the games tested, but let's just start with a couple of the heavy hitters here, talk about power, and then we'll see what the results look like. So on the screen now is the test bench we're using. As I just said, more information in the article below for testing methodology and results. We used 2 different GTX 1070s for this test because that's all we have available in these early days of the card. One, as you saw, was the MSI 1070 Gaming X. The other was a reference card. We ran the SLI configuration at the reference clock for these tests, giving us a clock versus clock comparison for a single 1070 versus 2. And we also tested the 1080 at its Founders Edition clocks in all of the tests. The only instance where we tested the pre-OC'd MSI 1070 standalone, meaning one of them at the pre-OC value, was in Mirror's Edge Catalyst because it's brand new and we're transitioning to the AIB partner cards for our benchmarks. Let's get into it with Doom first. Doom does not have good SLI scaling at this time. SLI is not officially supported in any respectable regard and currently forces AFR2 to achieve function without any real gains. At 4K, Doom is intensive on all devices. The 1080 FE operates at 51.7-ish FPS average, and that holds an imperceptible but measurable lead over the 1070 SLI configuration at 49 FPS average. So that's a 5.3% gap. That's outside of our sort of semi-expected 1% difference from the riser, but still very small. And a single GTX 1070 performs slower than the SLI GTX 1070s by 15.38%. So that's really not good scaling and would be poor value, laughable value for owners of 1070 SLI, but 4K is also intensive. At 1440p, SLI shows in a more exaggerated fashion its 1% low and 0.1% low frame time performance, which is less consistent than single cards. The SLI config only shows a 2.5% delta gain over a single card, making it completely pointless for Doom at this time. id Software and NVIDIA are supposed to be adding better SLI support in the near future, and Vulkan, but it's not here yet. 1080p is just as bad, with a 3.4% delta between averages with the single 1070 versus dual 1070s. And Doom is just like some other recent games we've tested, including Just Cause 3, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and some others, where SLI just doesn't offer any value at this time. Ashes of Singularity doesn't improve the narrative. Using the DirectX 12 API, the SLI GTX 1070s fall to the bottom of all charts in Ashes of Singularity, showing dismal frame times like 42.54 milliseconds average at 1080 high in DX12 against other NVIDIA devices, even all the single cards. This is a major downturn and is a result of SLI. It would actually be better to disable SLI for Ashes of Singularity in DX12, leaving the second card to rot in the case doing nothing. DX11 performance is more reasonable though, and frame times are closer to a single 1070, which pushes 20.46 millisecond frame times averaged versus 23.02 milliseconds for SLI. Scaling is around 5% for 1080p high, so that's really not good and definitely not worth it. You're gaining 5% for an extra $380 to $450 investment, but at least it's better than the DX12 dip, which was terrible. This is just one game though, so you really can't take much away from this other than the fact that SLI 1070s don't work well in Ashes of Singularity for DX12. And that's a very specific use case. It does not mean that they're bad in all DX12 games or in all games, just Ashes of Singularity with DX12. Let's move on to the Division. The Division shows an improvement over the last few tests. 4K post-scaling of 29.27% over a single 1070 FE card, and the SLI 1070s were on 8.76% faster than a single GTX 1080. The 1% and 0.1% lows are worse, though, and represent poor frame consistency, as tends to happen with SLI. 1440p shows better performance for the dual GPU setup. The 1070s in SLI push 118.3 FPS and hold a substantial 32.76% lead over the 1080. That's the 1080, not the 1070. 1% and 0.1% lows might not be as high as they should be, but are still superior to single GPU configurations, so we're still in good shape overall. Against a single GTX 1070, the SLI configuration holds a 50.37% lead in average FPS. 1080p scales about 38.3% over a single 1070, with the average FPS at 157. In its best case scenario, 50% scaling really isn't bad for the 1070s and begins to show some real value, but let's see how they do in Mirror's Edge Catalyst and GTA 5. This game just came out. You can view our separate GPU benchmark video on the title to learn more about the results overall and pitfalls and things like that, general intensiveness of the settings. Note that we did run the GTX 1070 Gaming X for this test rather than the Founders Edition, so we're comparing against a pre-overclocked single GPU here, not the Founders Edition. At 1080p Hyper, the GTX 1070 SLI tops the bench with 105.67 FPS average and retains fairly strong 1% and 0.1% lows despite being imperceptibly lower than the GTX 1080. The SLI configuration scales 23.68% over a single GTX 1070, which is 83.3 FPS, putting it within 3 FPS of the single GTX 1080, or about a delta of 3.5%. 4K high shows a gap of 4 FPS between the 1080 and 1070 SLI, and a gap of 17 FPS between the 1070 and 1070 SLI. The 1080 and 1070 SLI are separated by 7.55%, but the 1% and 0.1% low metrics are much higher on the single 1080, showing a 22.3% delta for 1% lows and about the same for 0.1% lows. This is a fairly constant trend for SLI and Crossfire, and versus a single 1070 non-SLI, we're seeing delta values of 36.56% for the average FPS, with the 1% and 0.1% lows marginally improving. Note again that this single GTX 1070 here is the Gaming X, so the gap is shrunken versus a reference 1070 with a lower clock rate. At 1440p, we see a delta of 8.4% with the 1070s and SLI versus the 1070 single card. But remember that the settings have changed from high at 4K to ultra on 1440p, which shifts some of the load in the pipeline to be more intensive after rasterization because there's so much more post-processing going on. The 0.1% lows are a fair bit reduced for SLI versus the non-SLI setup, posting 48.67 FPS, 0.1% low, versus 63 FPS, 0.1% lows. 1080p Ultra was pretty uninteresting. You can see those results briefly on screen now, but check the article for more detail on that. GTA 5 at 4K shows 55.8% scaling versus a single GTX 1070 in the average FPS department, so that's finally a major improvement. 1% and 0.1% lows are also improved and now land above 30 FPS. This makes 4K at very high, ultra sort of mixed settings completely playable on SLI GTX 1070s, whereas a single 1070 sees enough dips in performance in 1% and 0.1% lows to necessitate a very slight settings reduction. Versus a GTX 1080, the SLI 1070s at 4K show an improvement of 34.07%. So even against the $700 FE version, the 1080, we're getting a 34% performance gain with effectively reference clocks on SLI 1070s. That's pretty reasonable value anyway. We hit a CPU bottleneck at 1080p with the GTX 1080 and SLI 1070s, and effectively the one GTX 1070 all landing at around the same 120 to 125 FPS limit. So you can't really use these results because of that bottleneck. So this is just a cross section of our tests. We also did Black Ops 3, Shadow of Mordor, and Metro Last Light, and all those are in the article below. Very quickly, Black Ops 3 did show some pretty insane scaling in a good way in some of the tests, including at least 50% gains, and in some cases more than that. So it really just depends on the game you're testing, how good the gains are. Others, like The Division, or rather Mirror's Edge Catalyst, Doom, results are kind of mixed in some cases, or just terrible depending on the game. So it all depends. But let's talk quickly about the power and then get into the conclusion here. Just to quickly make a note of power draw, you obviously do consume more power by going with an SLI setup versus a single GPU setup. That's an immediate drawback, but can be overlooked by some users. So it's really up to you whether or not you fall into that group where it's something you can overlook. The SLI 1070s post a full system draw of over 300 watts when running the Graphics Test 2 3D Mark benchmark. And you can see the 1070 single card and 1080 single card power draw metrics also in this chart, with the 1080 doing a bit better in terms of power draw overall, but it's weaker in some gaming. So just depends on what you're after. So that pretty much concludes our testing of our next Franken build, which is this really crazy riser card. I mean, it's not that crazy, but I guess a better word would be precarious or haphazard, or a lot of money waiting to be in a trash can if the bridge becomes loose. But we tested it, it went pretty well. I wouldn't recommend building it this way, but let's talk about if it's worth doing at all in terms of just SLI 1070s versus a single 1070. First of all, SLI and Crossfire have always been a hard sell. That's because of there's a lot of complexity. So the risk is obviously a game comes out, it's not optimized by the developer or by the drivers to run SLI or Crossfire. In such an instance, you basically end up with one functional card and then a brick that does nothing. You go disable Crossfire SLI through the control panel for your GPU vendor, turns it off, doesn't do anything. So obviously as a consumer that feels pretty bad, because you've got, in this case, $380 to $450, depending on the price of the card, doing nothing in your build. And that could have been put towards something like a single 1080, of course, and you'd actually be spending less money. So that's the risk with SLI. Now the gain is, when there are gains, they're pretty good, and they can put you, in theory, beyond what a single 1080 can do, which we've tested and you've seen in some instances. So that's the risk with SLI. Lower frame rates and poor frame times are also an issue, where you'll see these 1% and 0.1% low metrics dipping below a single 1070, even though the average is higher. And depending on how they dip, if it's a really hard hit, it introduces something called micro stutter, or really just there's sort of really nasty judder when you're playing. And that's not something you want. That's actually worse, even though you've got a higher average. It plays worse with the micro stutter, so it makes sense again to disable SLI. So that's one of the other issues here. AFR introduces some of these, just general complexities, having multiple devices introduces some of these, and a lot of games now are also moving to interdependent frames, which means that the frames depend on one another when they're being rendered. So that's either temporal anti-aliasing or temporal effects or post-processing, all this stuff that happens at the end of the GPU pipeline after geometry and rasterization. That's all at the end, and when they're interdependent, it's worse for SLI. And that's why NVIDIA is moving away from SLI, at least in terms of three-way, four-way SLI, if not all SLI altogether in the future. But for now, they've moved away from three-way and four-way SLI, and they require an enthusiast key to unlock it. And that's why. It's because of both these frames now, the way they're being rendered, because the new APIs, DirectX 12 and Vulkan, it changes the way games address multiple GPUs. Still, there are some benefits. So in Black Ops 3, we saw huge gains where if you even had a 200 hertz monitor, which is absurd, you could actually fulfill that full 200 hertz with 200 frames per second, and you'd actually be saturating it, depending on your graphics settings, of course. 1080p, you'd be fine. 1440p, I think we're at 180 FPS, which is tremendous. It's a lot of frames for a game like Black Ops 3. So there are benefits, and Black Ops 3 is one of those games that's actually very, almost surprisingly well optimized for all vendors. So there's good things. We saw 50% scaling and beyond in games like GTA 5, sometimes in The Division. And that's useful for 144 hertz gaming or just to make 4K playable, because GTA 5, very high in ultra settings, 4K is not really perfectly playable on even a 1080. And the 1070s in SLI step past that and make it now pretty playable, more than 70 FPS in some instances. So that's good too. And then two 1070s will cost more than one 1080, so that's one thing to note here. One 1080, you buy a cheap one, $600. You buy a middle of the road one, $650. Let's put these at sort of the low end. Let's say you buy these for $400 each. That's $800. So spending $200 to $150 more for this setup. So you want to get $200 to $150 more performance out of it, and that doesn't always happen. Even at its best, though, we're seeing deltas of around 30% versus a single 1080, so that's decent. But whether that's worth it is up to you, and it depends on the game too. So it can cancel out depending on if you're playing a lot of different types of games where 1070 just doesn't even work in some instances like Doom, then you kind of lose out. Multi-GPU, it's still a hassle. It's still a big bet to make. You sort of have to look at our data on a game-by-game basis, decide for yourself if you like it or not, and hopefully the data is enough for you to make that decision. Now, I don't normally personally give an opinion on what I would do with if I were in your situation trying to buy cards, but I normally do with SLI and Crossfire, and that's because it's kind of a weird genre of buying devices that is hard to figure out on your own. So here's what I would do. I would not buy two 1070s personally, and I've said this, I think, in every SLI or Crossfire test we've done. I would still buy a single card. That's because I play a lot of different types of games when I do play games, and I don't want to deal with the issue of it just not working, which is what happens with something like Doom or some of the other games we've tested. So Ashes of Singularity is another good example. So I would still be buying a single card, maybe a 1080 if I were spending that much money, or waiting and seeing what else comes out. Of course, the 480s are coming out. They're talking big about Crossfire, so we'll try and validate that, see if the claims are reasonable. And if they are, and if Crossfire does better than SLI, well, maybe that'd be a reasonable option. But otherwise, I'd be looking at a 1080 rather than two 1070s. Save some money, you get good performance. Sure, in some games you're 30% slower, but it's still so good that it's kind of like, who cares? So that's how I look at it. But as always, all the information's on the website link below for you to work out yourself. Thank you for watching. Patreon link to the post-roll video. Subscribe for more content, and I'll see you all next time.